Hello, Round Earthers. It is Tuesday, February 13th, and this may be my last interview for a while. I'm going to be working on a book, and Gabe is sadly leaving us at Rounding the Earth, meaning that I don't have as much time to focus on the podcast as much myself. But I suspect that I'll still be coming on here and there. But my last guest before we take a hiatus is Cynthia Chung, and I'm going to bring Cynthia in now. Hi, Cynthia. Nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
And Cynthia's husband has been on here before, Matt Arrett, and we've had some great discussions. They are co-founders of the Rising Tide Foundation. Did I get that right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And Cynthia's Substack has been one of the ones that I have read most consistently over the past 12 months or so. I don't know when I found it or when I started, but I saw, I can't remember who I saw first writing about things that I was just starting to read about more in depth myself, meaning this strange historical thread of UFO religions. That particularly it really ramped up the past since World War II, but it was already going on in the 1800s and beyond. And the two of you connect it to today's geopolitics, but also trends throughout history, which has helped me. You guys have probably been a quarter of what I've read on these topics, but very often it's given me threads to go back to source material. So I've just been ever so grateful as I've been understanding the history of that. But you've been on a little bit of a tear recently. I feel like you've been in my inbox a lot this week that I've been reading through, and maybe looking at today's geopolitics a little bit more the past week or so. So maybe we can start somewhere there, because you've been writing about Putin and the Ukraine war, and a lot of people, I think people in general don't know what to think about Putin, because he's always been such a wild card, over the past 30 years, or since soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I'm going to leave it there and let you pick up where you might want to. What's going on there?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think most of your viewers are aware that President Putin gave an interview with Tucker Carlson, which was pretty special in the sense that, first of all, he was given such a large platform to speak on that was American, especially American based, but also Western oriented. But that he had basically 2 hours to speak his mind on things in a rather open, uninterrupted manner. And, a lot of Americans were confused as to how, President Putin at the very beginning, he kind of just, before Tucker could really ask too much of a question, went into like almost 30 minutes of a historical overview of the Ukrainian-Russian relationship. And, I think that he could have possibly have been a bit more clear in some areas. But the thing is that the subject is incredibly sensitive. So I think that was one of the reasons why he couldn't be so explicit that this was an intervention basically on the issue of the far right Ukrainian nationalists that do exist in Ukraine, which was primarily what caused the whole civil war situation in the first place, which is a situation that has been backed by the CIA and NATO. And the CIA involvement in far right Ukrainian nationalism has been ongoing since the end of World War II. But there were issues that were starting even before then, but explicitly a CIA funding of this, with the Mykola Lebed being accepted into the CIA and being allowed to basically use CIA funds to have propaganda continue in the Ukraine, oddly enough, when the Ukraine was still supposed to be a part of the Soviet Union.
You did a piece of research that may help a lot of viewers move into this transition between World War II and now, which was you went back and studied who the NATO commanders were. So after World War II, well, what is it that we know about NATO? And I think this will help a lot of people gather a sense, because a lot of people think of the Nazi Empire as having just been defeated, and that's the end of the story at the end of World War II. But what's going on there?
Yeah, well, for the Central and European, Eastern European Command of NATO, that was a position that was pretty much given to former Nazis after World War II for 16 years straight, if not more. And the even like Germany, right? It's a very strange story. Like, people don't seem to bring up this paradox, even though it's kind of widely recognized that Germany was split up between, the Western and the Eastern side. The Soviets had taken the Eastern part of certain parts of Germany, and a good chunk of Germany was occupied by NATO, America, Britain for 10 years, and they were not allowed to be. That occupation only ended when they agreed that they would join NATO. But the other weird thing about that was that, they were being punished. They were kind of like being treated. The people were being punished for the Nazi regime, which I'm not saying the people weren't held to a certain degree accountable, but let's be honest here. We should be going after, the leaders of the Nazi regime, and not the people, as instigators of this whole thing. But the weirdest thing was that the person who was in charge, who was given the responsibility by Alan Dulles, again, the director of the CIA, for ensuring Germany's security and overseeing Germany's intelligence apparatus, was again a former Nazi, Reinhard Gehlen, who was like, one of the top people under Hitler. And this guy actually, I wrote a book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Sets, a lot of information which I won't be able to go through in just like an interview. But Reinhard Gehlen was basically the overseer of the Gladio, the secret NATO armies, and especially was overseeing the Eastern European and Middle Eastern branches of this secret army under NATO. That was originally Churchill's secret army. So, people should wonder, like, why would a former Nazi be given that kind of level of responsibility by the CIA once again? So there's a lot of very troubled.
If I could cut in there, it is a weird thing. Like, after the end of some sort of strange war like World War II was, and okay, well, who are we putting this country in the hands of? Right? It's in many ways, it's almost unavoidable that you're going to have people involved in the Nazi Party still being involved in society, right? You couldn't split industry and the Nazi Party. You couldn't split international, leadership and the Nazi Party, because there had been so much power consolidation already. But NATO is a little bit different, right? Like the going from, who had some responsibility still in the post-World War II Germany, the NATO connection, that one is just so weird. But it really does feel like, and you helped bring this to my attention, which is that there was still this clash between Nazism and communism, and that this clash never really ended, and that what we were taught, what I was taught in my textbooks, in these terrible textbooks that we're given to study in middle school and high school and beyond, we're given this sort of I don't know, this image of, okay, well, Nazism just went away and there's just communism now. But Ukraine is a great example of where that battle was always sort of still ever present. It seems like Germany to Ukraine, a lot of nations in there still had pieces of both entities, both ideologies, struggling in partisan competition, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and also, just to be clear, I mean, I agree with you that there were so many people, like you said, in industry and politics that were of the Nazi Party, and you wouldn't be able to just get rid of all of those people. But at the same time, the people who should have been tried as criminals, war criminals during Nuremberg, should not have been given those positions. So Gehlen was one of those people, and like Adenauer, who was the chancellor of Germany during that time, he didn't want Gehlen. So Adenauer was not fully in charge of, making decisions for his country. It was the CIA that had forcefully brought in Gehlen into that position when there were other people that could have been chosen. And I think that's where people have to really realize, if you were guilty of war crimes, you should have been dealt with. And that's one of the problems why a lot of this has kind of continued, and it went underground in some ways after World War II, because it was a loss. They thought that they were going to win, and there were networks within Britain and the United States that were also very much on board with this plan, which is also tied to a League of Nations sort of concept. But because we didn't go after that, and we didn't clean up enough, and we did have certain people installed that really were ideologues and also guilty of war crimes, it's a problem that we're now faced with again. And a lot of Americans think they're under the impression that we fully defeated this thing that we were fighting in World War II, when in reality it just got infiltrated, or it got absorbed into both NATO and the CIA as well was very much backing this. For instance, the Gladio, the secret armies, a lot of the problems in South America that is also connected with, CIA activity, Green Beret activity. It wasn't the communists that were responsible for the drug issues in South America, the terrorism and this sort of stuff. It was by far organized by Gladio networks, which meant that they were always working closely with Nazis, as well as American institutions like the CIA, like the Green Berets. So this is a very dark thing that is not just about talking about something that happened decades ago. It's still an issue today. It's still behind the scenes today.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know how many former Nazis went to Argentina. I've heard numbers like in the tens of thousands, but it wasn't part of the very simple, overly simple story that we were told when we began to study all this as children. But I've actually wondered more and more how connected really, there's so much that is fake once wars for profit started to grow up historically. It feels almost like there are people on both sides from beginning to end, especially during the world wars. And, Edward VIII comes to mind, right? He married an American Nazi, which already speaks to how much influence there was being shared between what we think of as the Allies and the Nazis. But then Prince Bernhard of Lippe Biesterfeld, I don't know how to say that for sure. But, in the Netherlands, you have all these people who history counts as allies, but, he was a member of the Schutzstaffel.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yeah,
and so you got these. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
I couldn't hear that.
No, I'm a bit lagging in my speed, so I that's why my timing is a bit off. No, you can finish your thought.
Oh, well, I think I'd finished it there. I just wanted to, for people to get a sense, to point out these major figures. Many people who also think that those guys, including Edward VIII, passed information to the Nazis. And so, when you kind of step back into the big picture, you've got this set up Nazi communist conflict, and it doesn't just end with World War II. There are so many signs of continuation. And, this is, for anybody out there, this is one of the things that I noticed Cynthia writing about that caused me to start reading her Substack a lot, was realistic discussions of these shared influences. People know that there was Henry Ford was, supporting the Nazis, and there's weird, questionable stuff with some of the oil companies like Texaco. But the more you step back and look, the more you realize it's very organized influence. And so, the Nazi Party may simply have become a little bit more married to the occult West than even the overt.
I have actually an interesting Oh, sorry. I just have an interesting point you just made me think of that Americans really need to be aware of as well, because you're talking about the whole communist versus Nazi thing, and a lot of people think, well, Stalin was just also a Hitler and all of this. But the reality of World War II was that the Nazis and Mussolini's fascisti were primarily being fought against by Stalinists. And like communists, it's a kind of broad word. Obviously Trotskyists are not the same as Stalinists. It was the Stalinists who were fighting, to the point where Italy, this is well known, it's well documented, that the first elections that were going to be held in the world after World War II, when the Nazis had been defeated, and, Italy had Mussolini, they had it extra bad. It was known that they were going to almost assuredly vote for the communists, because the communists had been the ones to primarily fight against the Mussolini forces. And there was an incredible amount of organization amongst these groupings. I'm going to go over another case study of Greece, which is especially applicable for Americans to know about. But this first elections in Italy was what gave the CIA its new mandate, where originally it was supposed to be more of a desk job. And it was given, the authority to intervene into the Italian elections. It was given new, kind of purview, so that it could interrupt this, because in favor of I think it's called the Christian Democratic Party in Italy, which was known to have a whole bunch of Nazis that had taken over that party. And so they intervened, and what they did is they started to do terrorist activity. And this is well known, it's well documented in Italy. It's called the Years of Lead. It was about 20 years of this, but it was to continuously blame this on the communists. And it was later exposed in Andreotti's, the prime minister of Italy, or president, sorry, I don't know if it's which one it is, Andreotti's speech in 1991, where he admitted to like the Senate or something like this, that all of this had been orchestrated under the Gladio network, all of this terrorist activity. And the justification that they were saying, and the CIA was involved in this, was that they had to do it in order to save the Italians from the communists. So of course, we're starting to get into some, the Northwoods plot. That's a very notorious one too, by Lyman Lemnitzer, who is the head of the Pentagon, to Kennedy. He actually had the nerve to say, hey, why don't we have terrorist activity on our own people and our military, and blame it on Castro, so that we have an excuse to invade Cuba. This is also well documented, the Northwoods
Yeah,
plot.
that was the original fly a plane into a building, right?
There were several things that he was yeah, exactly, I get your joke now. But the one of the big ones too was Greece. So this was actually during World War II. World War II had not even been done yet, and the Stalinists in Greece were doing an amazing job. It was initially the Mussolini forces that they were fighting against, and they had defeated them. And then the Nazis ended up coming into Greece, because Greece was a very big strategic location as well. And later on, when Greece was taken over, Athens was the big Gladio center that would immediately connect into the Middle Eastern networks. So anyway, the Nazis came in, and the British were helping the Stalinists, although they were smaller in number. They were helping them. Churchill then gives the order, and this is also under evidence. I have the details in my book. I can't remember exactly. And Daniela Ganser also talks about this in his very famous book on the NATO armies. Churchill then orders a kind of a terrorist organization to fight the Stalinists, so that it's not going to be obviously the British soldiers directly fighting the Stalinists on the side of the Nazis, but he had set up this other thing called sheep is in it. Sorry, I can't remember the name of it. But it's in my article on Gladio on my Substack Through a Glass Darkly for people who want to know more details on this. So even then, the Stalinists were really good, and they were fighting back both this new terrorist apparatus set up by Churchill and the Nazis. And then they got the Americans to come in, and this is the Truman Doctrine. So this was the first, thing that allowed that started the whole Americans going into other countries and intervening in this sort of way where they basically dropped napalm on the Greek people who were fighting against, actually, I think at this point they had defeated the Nazis, and I think it was the end of the World War II, but they made an excuse that the communists couldn't continue running. They wanted to put in place a monarchy, reestablish a monarchy that they knew was pro-Nazi, and the Americans ended up dropping napalm on the Greek communists, and they terrorized the people to such a point that they really broke Greece, and Greece ended up being one of the first to enter NATO. But it was one of the most disgusting things. It was the first thing that the Americans did that kind of like sold their soul in a really bad way. So that's, again, one of these like dirty sides of history that is actually really, really well documented, but most people are not aware of this.
Yeah, one thing that I've realized more and more, especially having begun to dig into more history. I was not much of a reader of history until about 8 years ago, and I've had to pick up pieces here and there as I've read a few dozen books and begun to find other people like you who are looking to kind of correct what's been turned into a very superficial set of history stories. One of the things that I popped up on with Greece in particular that winds up hitting with some of your other work is Greece is one of the countries where these alien UFO religions have had a footprint. Greece, maybe it was mid 1990s. There were a number of European nations that said, hey, the American government is using Scientology to infiltrate and disrupt our societies. And Greece in particular invaded the Scientology office in Athens and found documentation that that Scientology was being funded there by the CIA. So I wanted to share that story with you. I'll email you that documentation later, since that's something that you work on and have been thinking about. But just wondering about how much history is fake, right? Like how many of these terrorist events that have happened in different countries since World War II have often been blamed on the other side. I think this is important for people to understand, Americans, North Americans to understand in particular, because we are in this very, very weird political moment. It feels like, this coming election in the US, things have been, you can't say otherwise that things have been more bizarre than ever the past decade or so. It just really feels like it's ramping up. But now we have these events going on that I don't know exactly what's going on, but it really feels like this is not what we're being told. And like a good example is this giant migration that's coming up from Panama area and Sino-US relations. I feel like every story we're told has some alternate agenda going on there. But like China has risen up greatly, and meanwhile they've got this inverted population pyramid, which is going to cause some kind of pains going forward. But then I look at this migration going on from Panama, and I'm like, are we shoring up our population pyramid? Right? Like, is that actually part of the point right there? But it's going to be sold as potential disaster terrorism, fear porn. How might that be used politically? And I have like a number of hypotheses, but it's very hard to narrow them down. But you look at the Sino-US sort of propagandization of that relationship a bit. Is that something you can talk about?
Well, I'm a Canadian, just for people to be aware, living in Montreal, Quebec. So that already kind of puts me a little bit more distant from this migration issue, which is clearly something that is being promoted by the United States government. But how I view the Chinese relationship to, for instance, the Panama thing is that now the Belt and Road Initiative is a project that is building a whole bunch of development economic booster projects all over the world, including in Central America. And this has become all of these areas that, especially like Panama has always been a really big hot zone of like control. The Americans should realize that they're the ones that actually created Panama as a colony that originally was Colombia under Teddy Roosevelt, and then later on, invaded Panama in 1989 and had a whole bunch of debt trap, predatory actions against Panama that John Perkins goes over in his Confessions of an Economic Hitman. So there's a lot of this predatory action that has happened in Central America and South America from the Anglo-American intelligence and financial apparatus. People should, first of all, just acknowledge that big elephant in the room. And what the China are doing is that they're doing economic boosting projects. So of course, that's going to upset the hegemonic power that wants the exact opposite, because what happens when you have economic booster projects? You have increased sovereignty of that nation. So these areas have now throughout the world, including in the Middle East, the Chinese have a lot of Belt and Road projects, are hubs for terrorist activity to attack these areas. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of secrecy. First of all, like they want to have these areas very closed off because you can have sabotage and you can have terrorist activities. There's been many Chinese construction workers who have been killed by terrorist activity in areas like these. And so people have to be aware that this is something that has been violently, like the attempt to sabotage these projects, which these countries have okayed. Panama wants these bridges. Panama wants these highways. And so you can say as an American, oh, but then those highways and bridges are going to make it easier for people to travel to America. But you have to really think about this. So what are you trying to say? Because ultimately it's the American government who's, they're encouraging a migrant crisis issue by not just allowing these migrants to come in, but let's take a bit of onus here. There's probably activity going on to create more people wanting to leave. And that has been the case as well in like the Middle East area. Actually, on this note, I want to share a story that probably a number of people are going to be familiar with. Colonel Fletcher Prouty, who was like Mr. X in Oliver Stone's JFK movie. And he, played a big role in being like the liaison between the Pentagon and the CIA. And he wrote, one of his book was JFK, I forgot the title, it's a really long title, but JFK and then like the Vietnam War. And one of the things that he brings up about the Vietnam War was that it was a completely artificial situation. Well, first of all, it started with a false flag, but the creation between the North and the South fighting against each other was a completely artificial situation, because you had the Saigon mission that was against the CIA under Edward Lansdale, who's notorious for doing all kinds of like weird stuff to play tricks, superstitious, tricks on the superstitious populace, including vampires. He did this in the Philippines. There's like a story of like, a very old legend of vampires in the Philippines. So they started to like strung up, bleed, empty them of blood, hanging them upside down. And the natives thought that there were Dracula or like vampires in the area, like this sort of thing. Lansdale was known for doing this. He was the head of the Saigon mission, and they terrorized the northern people. So Ho Chi Minh, the communists, they were in the north. They were terrorized, and Vietnam was a very quiet kind of like fishing or rice, harvesting area. It wasn't even really a country. It didn't have like a government. It didn't have taxes. It didn't have like anything you would say a government, would define a government. But rather they had coexisted with Chinese trade for many, many centuries. More recently, the French came in with their banking interests, but otherwise it's pretty quiet. Life hadn't really changed for centuries. It was always the same. So even with the whole communist thing with Ho Chi Minh, like most people were not like nothing was really changing in terms of daily life. Then Edward Lansdale comes in with the CIA Saigon mission, and they terrorize these people in all sorts of ways, so that they want to and are sort of forced to leave their homes. And then the military, the US military, is even saying, hey, we'll supply you with boats. They couldn't fit everybody on a boat, so that you can travel faster to the south to get away from whatever is like bothering you. And a lot of them even just migrated from the north to the south, because undoubtedly they were being terrorized by this CIA Saigon military mission. And so then it created a problem, because a lot of these northerners from Vietnam were told that they were going to be receiving some kind of resource, some kind of setup in the south. Instead, they were unleashed on the people in the south, and like people didn't have enough to support all of these new people coming in. So of course it created a problem with where the northerners who were dumped into the south were now forced to steal, and like crime, started to skyrocket and all of this. And then there was the excuse to start calling these northerners an invasion, a communist invasion. And the south tended to be like Catholic as well, and so they used this as an excuse then to start saying like, hey, this is going on. Another interesting note too is that Prouty said that there was such a thing called fun and games. So they would actually have diplomats or government officials who would get a tour of Vietnam by helicopter, and they would see like the battle going on underneath them. Prouty was saying that these battles that were being displayed for these kinds of people, in order to increase the paranoia of like why we needed to send even more Americans into Vietnam, that these were actually staged fights called fun and games. And this was also a tactic that was again used in the Philippines. Actually, a lot of the people who were trained under Lansdale in the Philippines were then brought into Vietnam to create problems in Vietnam. And they, I'm going to end up with this, but like Ramon Sese is an example that Prouty uses, where he got elected by the people because he apparently succeeded in, defeating this terrorist group. But what was happening is this terrorist group was going into villages and causing all these problems, and then the Ramon Sese group would come in and they would shoot them all, and then they would, put all the bodies into like a wagon and they would drive off. And then those bodies would get up and they would have drinks, have some food together and go to the next village and repeat the same thing. So it was a whole, ruse that they were doing to just kind of build up support for whatever that they wanted. So
Wow.
Again, Prouty is, a respected person, and I would imagine that there's a lot of this sort of stuff probably going on in South America and Central America right now.
I think so too. In fact, the moment you say this connects to a story that I read about. Do you know the name Harold Chipman? So Harold Chipman was CIA, and this is, I don't know exactly what years he's active. Brian McNamara years, who was JFK's head of the DoD and wound up being later the head of the Club of Rome and also the head of the World Bank. Maybe he may have been one of the nastier apples who was hard to understand within the JFK administration. I want to understand that story better. That's one of my bookmarks to read more about. But Harold Chipman was apparently one of those true psychopaths. Like, have you ever seen the movie No Country for Old Men?
Yeah.
Yeah. Harold Chipman would go and just, murder person after person in Vietnam. If there was somebody who wasn't going, maybe they didn't fool them with their psyops, or they were, beginning to organize against, what was going on within the Americans. And Robert McNamara. Thank you, Liam. Liam just corrected me in chat. I may have said the name wrong. But Harold Shipman would be the person who would find maybe some kid, pay the kid to say, to tell him, where does this person live in the villages around here, would just go to their house, and these weren't, fighters the way that he was trained to be. He was kind of a paramilitary, fighter in his time, and he would just, go from house to house with these names and just murder people. And, so
Wow.
what you have is a lot of people who are fooled or just over terrorized to the point that they can't organize, but those who aren't are just picked off one by one. And that is how you can take over a country. But I think that we are seeing things like that in South America and Peru, right? We have these alien sightings going on in Peru. And it's interesting to see who talks about this. One of the only influencers that I've seen talk about this was actually Russell Brand, but he seemed to skip over all the important points of how it is that we can be almost certain from the very beginning that this is an American-run psyop.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
But a lot of Americans don't know.
Points that are sorry, my internet's just really slow, so I have terrible timing. No, I think that how you're thinking about this is spot on, and I think that they're ramping both at the same time for a good reason. And I've said back, about a year ago that with holographic technology, which I'm sure there's a certain level of capability for holographic technology, that you can not only use this for UFO type sightings, but also for like religious fervor, right? You can start making it look like there's someone who's capable of miracles and things like this. And I saw a show on Netflix. I think it's called Warrior Nun. And Netflix is just interesting because they clearly they're putting things out there into the zeitgeist through the entertainment industry as sort of clues for what they want to do. And the train blowing up in Palestine, Ohio, I think is one of those really eerie examples of this, where there's a Netflix show where it was in Palestine, Ohio, that a train was going to blow up, releasing toxic chemicals into the air, and then it happens like a few months later. But and like this show, I think it was, they're talking about someone who's the ultimate illusionist, because that's what the whole UFO thing is. And I would say the whole occult, Freemasonry, Aleister Crowley, all of this, they consider themselves magicians, ultimately. And it's all about the trick of the sleight of hand, the illusion that you can create with these sorts of things. So there's a reason why they want to play on people's ability to even differentiate between reality and unreality, which is clearly also something being really pushed. And then you have the Elon Musk side of these things with the new goggles, which I'm sure are not anything special, but they really, really want to go into this area, because as soon as you can't differentiate between reality and unreality, you're like the most easy to control.
Yeah, and you were just talking about illusions. Wow, this is really fantastic. Oh gosh, I know I don't have enough time tonight because my schedule isn't allowing for as long a conversation as I would like to have about all this stuff. But you're hitting on some of the topics that made me go down this road. I grew up in a cultic organization called the Association for Research and Enlightenment, and that was interfacing with the U.S. government with respect to the remote viewing program. And what you just said about learning to craft illusions, when you look back, and I hadn't done this until the last year, when you look back at who all was building that program and running that program, I brought up Harold Shipman because he was the CIA's funding liaison to the remote viewing program, along with Werner Erhard. Werner Erhard was a Scientologist. And then who were the people at the remote viewing program? Well, you've got two top-level holdovers from MK Ultra, and those were Sidney Gottlieb, the LSD drug master, and then Jolly West, the psychiatrist who's like
Mm,
everywhere, both Kennedy assassinations, the Manson story, lots of MK Ultra stuff. Then you've got three Scientologists, Hal Puthoff, Pat Price, and Ingo Swann. And then you've got illusionists. You've got both Uri Geller, that's the more famous one, but people don't know this. Russell Targ was a stage magician. And you've got Michael Aquino was part of building that program, and people don't know this about him, but he was also part of the Magicians Guild. These are people who create illusions, they craft illusions, and I think they've been doing that through these fake religions that they've been building in order to control culture, control people, and they've been doing it in South America, and Americans don't even, especially here in the U.S., because we're taught so much. We're the economically dominant country on the planet, right? We're taught that beginning when we're young. Some of it's good, like you have a responsibility, but what we're not taught is that there were other rivals in the Americas. Like Chile's economy was like the fourth most productive in the world, and we went down and made sure that wasn't going to continue, I guess. I'm not even sure that the Salvador Allende Pinochet thing wasn't all set up from the beginning, because you've got Project Cybersyn, which is coming down from the British cybernetics experts. Stafford Beard was the person who architected all of that. And that whole, cybernetics group was being organized in the US by Rockefeller money. The Macy's, who organized the Macy conference, that was a Standard Oil family. So you have these repeated relationships from both the American intelligence agencies, but also what you would think of as the Western powers, like the Rockefellers.
yeah, well said.
Well, I was going to ask you about this. I don't know how tied into the Bitcoin discussion you are. And if you're not, we'll
Yeah,
go ahead and skip
I'm not.
that. I had
Okay.
thoughts about the migration coming up and everything right now, and I mentioned one of those earlier, which is that the whole U.S. China relationship. I think there's definitely I think more positive in that relationship than people realize. As in, there's probably a lot of working together that goes on. I mean, certainly there is. The economics of it are just astounding, right? The U.S. Chinese relationship in terms of building the world's supply lines, has involved a lot of cooperative effort at times in certain ways, probably more sculpted by the U.S. side, 50 years ago than it is now. But China's population pyramid is inverted, which means that China is going to have, may take a step back before it can take a step forward again, just in terms of so many retiring workers. And the U.S. seems to be taking advantage of its stability on this side, which is that the U.S. is one of the few countries that doesn't have this inverted population pyramid problem. And so we're bringing in all these migrants. At the same time, if we bring in 5-10 million migrant workers, well, that's a lot of people sending remittances to other countries. And how are they going to do that? Well, they can do it by giving up 35-40% to the banks, or they can do it with Bitcoin, which makes me wonder if this moment was always being viewed as a moment to sort of boot the Bitcoin network, which I believe more and more. I've steered, I'm like 70%, 70-30, that Bitcoin was really invented by the intelligence agencies and military intelligence in particular, but probably all of them, sort of working together. So I was going to throw that out. I hadn't heard you talk about Bitcoin, but I was just going to see if that was part of your, if you knew about, what was going on there, because I kind of see it starting to fit in now with these geopolitical, the rivalries that are springing up.
One thing I guess I can comment, which is not on Bitcoin directly, but I do agree with you that I don't think that Bitcoin was ever like a friend of the people. necessarily. But back to President Putin's interview with Tucker Carlson, I think that one of the really big points that was made, and Tucker Carlson didn't disagree, was that the Americans were the ones who were destroying their own dollar, and the fact that the strategy of the United States has been to sanction countries that they disagree with, and Russia was at the top of this list. And Putin made the point that despite Russia being the most sanctioned country by the United States, they came up as the #1 country in the Eurasian bloc for economy performance, despite the Ukraine war. And Putin said it wasn't because of the Ukraine war. And that's very interesting, that he says that. It's not because of the Ukraine war, but it's because of the direction of how things are going in the world. And it is curious to wonder why what is exactly the strategy of the United States, right? If it was coming from an honest intention, you'd think that you would not continue doing this because it's clearly making your economy weaker. It's, as Putin said, you're the worst enemy to your dollar. But I think that what it says is, and Putin also alluded to this in the interview, that the Ukraine war, which again, Putin made the point that he had to enter into it because from the Russian side of things, they were under the impression, and looking historically at how things were going, and the fact that the Maidan was a CIA operation, and that they were actively terrorizing people in eastern Ukraine. Like they were killing people in eastern Ukraine, and it was up to them to defend themselves against this like pretty much Nazi force that was coming after them, that views itself as ethnically pure Ukrainian, and that these eastern Ukrainians were Russian, which is true, and that they needed to be eliminated. And this is also a resource-rich area. So it was viewed by the Russian side that they had to come in because they were not going to allow these people to be slaughtered, and there was reason to believe that it was going to be stepped up even further. But it had already been going on for like 7 or 8 years, this kind of terrorizing on these people. It didn't happen like overnight. So it was actually quite patient of the wait time. And it was clear that it was only going to amp up. It wasn't going to get less. But one of the strategies of the West, and NATO, was that they wanted Russia to do that because they thought that Russia would break, because they knew that it was going to be a war that would have to be fought for a while. They know that the Russians are not going to want to just pummel over the whole area. If you followed how the Ukraine war has been fought, they've tried to do it in the most civil manner possible, just trying to take out and subdue things rather than just because they could have just bombed the whole area, right? They didn't do that. They did it the hardest way because they were trying to preserve as much as they could and not kill innocent civilians. So it was going to be a longer war. A lot of people, Putin lost his head, that he was reactionary. He didn't know what he was doing. Guess what? Now it's very clear Russia is on top of this entire geopolitical situation. And it was thought that Russia economically would not be able to survive this, because the reality is that perestroika is the reason why the Soviet Union dissolved the way it did. I'm not saying the Soviet Union was doing great, because they had a lot of bad leaders, Khrushchev on, but the perestroika was a Western predatory thing that came into Russia, and that's what controlled their central bank, for instance, and what caused all of these rich oligarchs who were, the Moscow on Thames at the City of London type gutting of the economy. And so to this day, there's still a lot of Western apparatus within the banking system of Russia. So they thought for sure Russia was not going to be able to survive this economically. That was the real, hope with the whole Ukraine thing. And so Russia has come out on top. The other thing is that the way things have been going, 2008 crash, we haven't changed anything since the 2008 crash. Why is that? If you really would not want to have a collapse, why would you continue to do things the same? It's because they wanted a collapse, because if you can control the collapse in your favor, you can control for further centralization in a kind of world government type sense. League of Nations, again, it's always the League of Nations blueprint. So right now there's a complete panic, because now they thought that that was going to be the launch of the collapse of the economy, was Russia, and Russia didn't go down. And now they're kind of, they're screwed, because they can't control the collapsing of the economy, the Great Reset, in their favor anymore, because about 70% of the population is not going to be affected by that. So they can basically blow themselves up at this point, but they're not going to blow up, these other financial kind of strongholds at this point. But for the longest time, Russia and China were not in a situation where they could have survived that. So they knew where it was going, and that's why they pushed the Ukraine war the way that they did.
I'm going to share something with you about gas and Bitcoin that sounds like you have some knowledge of cryptocurrency, but here's a piece that came to my attention when I was looking at the FTX disaster with Sam Bankman-Fried and all of that, which is that more and more Bitcoin mining is happening and going to be happening with stranded gas, right? People don't realize how much gas just gets burned off at its source, not used for any energy or anything. And that it's literally enough to run perhaps the majority of all the power that gets used in the United States if it were used on source, right? But you can't build lines to it economically in order to transport that power anywhere efficiently. So, when you look at the wars that the U.S. has been involved in, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, what do these things have in common? Gas pipelines, right? You've got the whole East-West. And if the U.S. is shifting between eras, then, this may be a play to keep the East under wraps as much as possible while transitioning. And people have been confused about I've been talking as honestly as possible about my thoughts of what's going on with Bitcoin. And Cynthia, you don't know this, but I'm a Bitcoiner insofar as I have been in Bitcoin for 6.5 years now. And I don't promote it as a technology. I educate people. I guess you could say I do promote it in that sense. I educate people about it. My thought is that it's probably a technology that will be productive. What it is it's a public ledger, right? And if you just think of it that way, and you thought, are there entities in the world like banks or governments that if they suddenly just had an open ledger, I would go, great. Would I wave a wand and do that? So I think that there's a place for it. Whereas I think that you're right. What you said is controlling the collapse of the dollar. That makes a lot of sense to me, in the sense of, okay, we just spent all this money, insane amounts of money during the pandemic. It makes no sense unless you think, okay, that debt is actually going to disappear because the dollar is going to decrease in value. And we do have something to replace it. If the intelligence agencies will have, Satoshi Nakamoto's Bitcoin, perhaps some other, crime happens and the government sucks up some Bitcoin from criminals, whatever. The US government could wind up with, 12-15 trillion dollars worth of Bitcoin. And if you just think about the budget from Bitcoin will probably grow at the same rate as world wealth growth after that, meaning just ordinary technological advancement. Think of the Bitcoin as you hold as having an interest rate. The government will probably be able to run the essential parts of itself off of the interest rate, but it will have to jettison the welfare state. And I think that you're right. And I think that these things do fit together, and it makes sense in terms of the migration, both shoring up the American pyramid, allowing a little bit more of a pivot to China. We can't do any more to Mexico because they've got 96% employment, but we built a pipeline to Mexico. And that seems like a clue. We had these qualified opportunity zones going on once Trump was elected. Maybe we were planning for those locations to accept a lot of the migrants Maybe we even have factories that are built there that people just don't even notice. We'd have to like pay attention and like look up what's being built in these 8,000 qualified opportunity zones that have tax deferment on capital gains to encourage wealthy Americans to invest in them. So it all fits together. I love talking with you and Matt and so many other people that I invite on here, because every time I do, I get another piece that fits with something that I've been looking at and studying. Right. I feel like there is a little bit of a white pill takeaway, which is that as much as horrible as many of the things that the West has done in the past, it almost feels like the weirdness of what's going on now speaks to a greater parity between the East and the West, and perhaps that greater parity, even if the West manages a transition in which the West holds more power than the East after that transition, it is more and more clear that the power parity has become closer than it was 80 years ago. And that, however things happen after the population pyramids resolve, we will, maybe we will find ourselves in a world that is a little bit gentler, without as much war, and perhaps without the League of Nations, United Nations under totalitarian control. At least I hope. I have my worries about, you open the gates with the League of Nations. People should go back and read more about it. The League of Nations, it says international relations. Look at their charter. They were also studying the dark markets, which is a big clue. This was Western intelligence agencies using the League of Nations to take greater and greater control of drug markets and human trafficking markets. And that is a lot of what the West has developed in a lot of these areas that Cynthia has talked about with us today. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give you a chance for final thoughts in just a moment. Unfortunately, because of dinner time and when my wife came home from work, I've got a stopping point here. But I'd so like to talk again sometime. And thanks for joining us. But any thoughts to close things out with?
Yeah, I guess I'll just again end it with what I think Putin's point was in talking to an American audience through Tucker Carlson, was that, there is a huge now agreement with the world collective in a good way. I mean, it's several nation states that have agreed that they don't want war anymore. I think that this is a very genuine thing. These are areas that have actually gone through almost endless war for most of the 20th century, and that there is a general optimism in the kind of economic, the prosperity that can come from economic development. Because obviously, if the standard of living increases, we all know that crime and all other types of problems in society also decrease. So it's not that much of a mystery, what economic development offers. And that at this point, I think that there is such a strength in that kind of focus, which is the focus the United States used to have under presidents like John F. Kennedy. It's an American legacy. And that's why so many people looked up to the United States for the longest time as the land of opportunity. That this is a beautiful thing, that so much of the world has continued that. And hopefully the United States will decide to also join in to that.
That is a very good point. After World War II, the U.S. did, in many ways, inflate the economies of the world out of poverty. And there are a lot of people who will point at some of the bad things that we've talked about today and will even think of them as justified in that process. But it's, these things can be separated. The good of America can be separated from the bad of America, at least in most cases. Thank you for that point, Cynthia, and thanks for joining us. And hope everybody enjoyed today's guest. I hope to have Cynthia on again. We're going to have a hiatus, but I do hope to be back to podcasting again once my the Chloroquine Wars, my book project, is finished. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll play a little outro music,